Montana Territory, 1877, the wind off the Bitterroot Mountains carried dust, and the scent of old pine through the town of Granite Bend, where Petra Calloway fell hard onto the wooden boards outside the mercantile, and not a single soul stopped. Her knees scraped, the basket of sewing notions scattered, and her shawl slipped from her shoulders. One man stepped around her. Another woman looked, frowned, and kept walking. The street buzzed with voices, none of them hers, and Petra stayed there a moment longer than she should have, stunned by the fall and by how invisible she had become. Then Boots stopped in front of her. "Ma'am," a voice said, low and steady. "You all right?" She looked up. The sky was behind his head, too bright for her eyes, but she could still make out the face. Young, maybe close to 30, sun-browned skin, a scar just under his jaw like an old story no one asked about. His clothes were dusted from the trail, a cowboy's gear, worn but cared for. He crouched beside her, gloved hand already reaching for the basket. She started, and her voice cracked. "Yes, I just tripped." "Well, let's get you up anyway," he said, lifting the basket and offering his other hand. She hesitated. No one had helped her in a long time. Not since her husband died 5 years ago, leaving her with a small house, a bad name she had not earned, and a daughter now buried on the hill. But she put her hand in his. He helped her up like it mattered. Like she mattered. "There," he said, brushing off her sleeve. "You need anything else?" "No, thank you." Her voice felt small, but she held his eyes. "I'm Petra Calloway." "Leif Nolan," he said. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Calloway." People still passed behind them, not looking. She did not care anymore. "Come on," he said gently. "Let me walk you home." She should have said no, but her knees ached and she was tired of walking alone. "All right." They walked side by side, the sun dipping low behind the church steeple. He was quiet but not awkward, and she liked that. He asked nothing about her past and offered nothing of his own unless she asked. "You new to Granite Bend?" she asked after a block. "Just rode in last night. Looking for work," he said. "Heard there's a cattle run starting out of Hobbs Ranch next week. Might ride with them. Long ride from here." "Yeah, but I go where the work is." They reached her gate. The house was plain but clean. She pushed it open and stepped in. "Thank you, Mr. Nolan." "Leif," he said with a half grin. "You sure you're all right?" She nodded. "I am now." He tipped his hat and walked back down the street. The next 3 days passed with more warmth in her chest than she had felt in years. She did not see him again until the 4th day, when she walked to the church to leave flowers for her daughter's grave. He was there, sitting by an empty hitching post, hat in his hands. "Miss Calloway," he said, standing when he saw her. "I thought you would have left already," she said. "Job fell through. Rancher hired his cousin instead." "I am sorry," he shrugged. "Happens." She looked down at the flowers in her hand. "You visiting someone?" he asked softly. "My daughter. She passed 3 winters ago," he nodded, quiet. "I come here too. My brother's buried up north of here, same kind of hill." Something shifted between them then. A small thing, quiet but real. "Would you walk with me?" she asked. He nodded. They walked up the path to the cemetery. She set the flowers down on the simple stone marked Polly Calloway. Leif stood beside her, not saying much, just being there. Afterward, they walked back slowly. "I have coffee brewing," she said when they reached her gate again. "Would you join me?" He smiled. "I'd like that." Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke. She poured 2 cups, set them on the table. They sat across from each other. He looked around the room with a kind of soft interest, not judging, just noticing. "This your place?" he asked. "It was my husband's. He died 5 years ago, consumption." He nodded with sympathy but did not press. "You have family?" she asked. "Not anymore." "Raised my brother after our folks died, lost him in Kansas during the war." They both sat with that for a moment. "I never remarried," she said quietly. "People here, they talk, think I was too proud. Or too stubborn. Maybe you were just waiting for someone who saw you." She looked at him then, her throat tightening. "I see you, Petra." She reached for her cup to keep her hands busy. He watched her without pressure, just steady eyes and a calm presence. Later that evening, when he stood to go, she walked him to the door. "Will you come back?" she asked. I will. And he did. Over the next week. He came by near every day, sometimes just to bring her a loaf of bread from the bakery, sometimes to fix the loose hinge on her gate. Always with a quiet respect that made her feel like herself again. One afternoon he brought hand-carved wooden animals, a small horse and a fox, and left them on her porch. "Did you make these?" she asked that evening. He nodded. "Used to carve for my brother. Thought maybe you'd like them." She held the fox in her hand, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Leif." They stood close then, closer than ever before. "I never thought anyone would see me again," she whispered. "Not really." "I did," he said. "From the moment you fell. I saw you." She reached up, touched his cheek. He didn't move away. "Would it be all right?" he asked, voice low. "If I stayed a while longer?" She nodded. "I would like that." And when he leaned down and kissed her, it was soft and warm and full of something new, not a beginning, not really, but something that had been waiting to bloom for a long time. They stood there as the light faded, wrapped in the kind of quiet that meant everything. Petra stood at the edge of her garden, sleeves rolled past her elbows, the hem of her skirt catching in the soft rise of spring grass. The soil smelled just turned, still cool from the thaw, and she pressed her boot heel into a mound before glancing up at the sound of approaching hooves. Leif dismounted at the gate, leading his horse by the reins. He waited until she looked his way before stepping through. "You said you wanted to dig up the southern bed," he said. "Figured I could lend a hand." She offered a small nod, brushing a curl from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "I was about to start." He tied the gelding to a fence post and moved beside her without speaking more than needed. The two worked in rhythm, her with the spade, him with a pick he'd brought from his saddlebag. The ground was stubborn in parts, packed over winters and summers both, but they worked steady until the first row gave way. "You always keep a garden?" he asked as he straightened, pushing his hat back just enough to wipe his brow. "I did when Polly was with me," she said, voice even. "Stopped for a while, but I've been thinking lately the yard feels too still without something growing." He nodded, not filling the silence she let fall. The wind stirred the cottonwoods at the edge of the property, leaves just beginning to show. After a while, he leaned on the handle of the pick. "Town's been quiet, but I heard the blacksmith's looking for help with wagon repairs. Could be something steady." "You think you might stay on then?" she asked, not looking at him. "I was thinking I might," he said. "If I had reason." The spade paused in her hand, pressed against the earth. She didn't answer right away, just reached down and broke a clump of soil between her fingers. "There's a seed catalog in my trunk," she said at last. "From Missouri. I haven't opened it since the war ended." A faint smile touched her mouth. "Might be time." He stepped closer then, not crowding her, just near enough she could feel the presence of him, a quiet weight like a warm coat handed over on a cold morning. "I could build you a trellis," he said. "For the climbing beans if you want them." Petra glanced over at him. "You any good with a hammer?" "Passable. Better with a plane." That made her laugh, short and surprised. "I'll hold you to that." They finished turning the bed before the light shifted gold. She offered to fry what bacon she had left, and he agreed with a quiet "if it's no trouble." Inside, they worked side by side. He chopped onions while she mixed cornmeal, and the small stove did its best to fill the room with warmth. After they ate, she leaned back in her chair, eyes catching on the faded quilt over the rocking chair by the hearth. Her fingers traced the rim of her mug. "You don't ask much, do you?" she said. "I figure if a thing's worth knowing, it'll be shared when someone's ready." She looked at him, long and steady. "There's a letter I never opened, came 2 years after my husband passed. From his cousin in Idaho, I never could bring myself to read it." Leif didn't shift or press. "I think I will," she said. "Tonight," he nodded. "You want me to stay after?" "No," she said, then softened. "But come by tomorrow if you're free." "I will." He stood, setting his empty mug in the basin. At the door he paused. "Petra," she looked up. "I know it's early and I'm still a stranger in some ways, but I feel more myself here than I have in years." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "That's not nothing." He tipped his hat and stepped out into the dusk. She sat a while longer, watching the light shift against the walls. Then she crossed to the small drawer beside her bed and took out the letter she'd kept sealed for 6 years. She broke the wax and unfolded the paper with hands that no longer trembled. Morning stitched itself slow and golden across Petra's kitchen window as she folded the letter and slid it back into its envelope. The words inside weren't cruel, just hollow, a distant cousin offering to settle her husband's accounts, but not much else. No mention of Polly. No ask of how Petra had managed alone. Just a neat closing line and the date. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to tend the stove. The biscuit tin was low, but she'd enough flour to stretch a few days more. Outside, the larkspur was starting to rise through the thawed soil, and the garden bed looked less like a wound and more like a promise. She hadn't expected the knock. Light, like someone unsure of their welcome. When she opened the door, Leif stood there, coat collar damp with snowmelt, his shirt sleeves rolled beneath it as though he'd dressed in a hurry. "Morning," he said, eyes searching hers. "You all right? I read it," she answered. He waited. "It didn't say anything I needed," she added. "But it's done now." He gave a small nod, then stepped back and looked around the porch. "You ever think about bees?" She blinked. "Bees? There's a man outside Deer Lodge who sells boxes, keeps hives in the alder groves. Said they do well with early wildflowers." He glanced at the edge of her garden. "Could give you honey, pollinate the squash come summer." She leaned against the jamb, arms crossed, her gaze curious. "You thinking of staying long enough to see squash?" "I was hoping to." She stepped aside, leaving the door open. "Come in, I've just put coffee on." They sat across from each other again, but the air between them had shifted. It wasn't new, just clearer. "I went to the smithy this morning," he said, wrapping his hands around the mug she set in front of him. "He's willing to train me, says I've got the arm for it. It's not trail work, but it's honest. Would you miss the riding? A bit. But I've had enough dust in my teeth for a while. Might be time for something steadier." She studied him. "You ever lived in one place more than a season?" He smiled faintly. "Not since I was 17. I don't know what it's like to share a house with someone who isn't leaving." "I'd like to learn," he said. "If you'd let me." She didn't answer right away. Her fingers curled around her mug and she looked down at the table for a moment. "You don't know how I keep," she said. "I can be quiet for days. I forget to eat when I sew. I don't cry much, but when I do, I don't want anyone near me. I don't need much talking. I eat what's given, and I don't mind quiet." She looked up. "You really think it'd work?" "I think I'd rather try with you than be sure somewhere else." She pushed her chair back slowly and came around the table. He stood when she reached him. They faced each other with the wood stove ticking behind them and the window spilling sun across the floor. "I've only kissed you once," she said. "That's not much to build on. It's enough to start." She reached up, touched the side of his face again, and this time the kiss was longer, deliberate, sure. When they pulled apart, he didn't speak. He just rested his forehead against hers. "I've got a room at the boarding house through Sunday," he said softly. "But I'd rather spend my evenings here if you'd have me." She nodded. "Bring your tools. I've got a shed that needs sorting. And if you're serious about those bees, we'll need to clear the east fence." He grinned, and this time it reached his eyes. "This isn't a small thing," she said. "Nothing about you is." She took his hand and led him to the back room. She opened the trunk by the bed and pulled free the seed catalog, yellowed at the edges but still intact. She laid it on the table between them. "Pick something," she said. "Whatever we plant first, we'll plant together." He turned the pages slowly, careful not to bend them. His hand brushed hers once, and neither of them pulled away. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like it had always been meant to bring someone home. By the time the first frost lifted for good, Leif had cleared the east fence and Petra had started her seedlings in small clay pots along the windowsill. Together they built the trellis from rough-cut pine he'd planed smooth, each slat nailed with care. He took to the blacksmith's forge in the mornings, coming home with his shirt damp and his knuckles blackened, while she mended linens for the pastor's wife and stitched aprons for the butcher's daughters. They shared supper most evenings, now her stew, his cornbread or sometimes cold potatoes and ham eaten on the porch with their sleeves rolled up and their boots off. The rhythm of it settled around them, quiet and sure. That Sunday, Petra took him to the creek past the old mill where the cottonwoods grew in clusters and the water moved slow and clear. She carried a small basket and wore her straw hat low against the sun. "My mother brought me here when I was a girl," she said, stepping over a root. "We'd pick watercress and early onions. I haven't been back since before Polly." He didn't speak, just followed her lead, watching how she moved through the underbrush, deliberate but not cautious. They reached the bank, where patches of green curled along the edge of the stones. She set to gathering, hands skilled, her skirt brushing the damp grass. He knelt beside her and worked the other side, neither of them rushing. "Do you miss what you had?" she asked after a while, not looking up. "Before all this, before me." He lifted his eyes to her, the breeze tugging loose one of the strands from her braid. "I miss my brother," he said. "Not the years I spent chasing work. Sometimes I think I don't remember what it felt like to be touched without sadness underneath it." He shifted closer, still crouched, his voice low. "There's no part of you I reach for out of pity." She nodded once, eyes steady on his. "I know." They stayed there until the sun dipped low enough to silver the water. On the walk back, she took his hand without speaking, fingers threading through his like it had always been that way. At the edge of her garden, he paused. "I've saved near enough to buy a parcel just west of town," he said. "Small stretch, good light, needs fencing." She studied his face, noting the faint line above his brow she hadn't seen before, likely from squinting at the forge. "You want to leave this place?" "No," he said. "I want to build something with you, but I'd never ask you to give up what you've made here." Petra looked toward the house, the chimney dark now, the porch in need of paint, and then back to him. "I've kept this home because it was all I had left," she said. "But I think I'd rather grow something new than live with ghosts." He didn't reach for her, just waited. "I'll come with you," she said. "We'll need to dig a well, and I'll want a window facing east. I'll build it myself." "You'll ask me where it goes," she returned, lips twitching. He gave a soft chuckle. "Every nail if you want." Later, as dusk softened the corners of the yard, they sat on the steps with the basket between them, the gathered greens washed and bundled. The hush between them felt full, not empty. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his hand over hers where it lay on his knee. "I never thought peace would feel like this," she murmured. He kissed the top of her head, slow and sure. "Me neither." And the night settled around them like a quilt pulled close, familiar, warm and stitched with the promise of all that would come next. By early May, the land west of town had dried enough for Leif to begin hauling lumber. Petra rode with him the first morning, her hands gloved, a coil of twine in her apron pocket. The wagon creaked under the weight of split boards, and the smell of cedar clung to everything by the time they reached the clearing. The parcel stretched wide and open, with a slope on the north end and cottonwoods edging the south, their leaves young and trembling in the breeze. A single stone marker stood near the center, nothing carved, just a chunk of river rock upright in the soil. "Someone buried here?" Petra asked, stepping down. Leif nodded and ran a thumb along his jaw. "Was already here when I staked the claim. Could be settler or traveler. I figured best to leave it be." She lowered her voice. "Good." They marked the foundation with stakes and twine, measuring by paces and sightlines. Petra pointed to a stand of chokecherries. "Kitchen window should face those. They'll bloom come June." Leif made note of it with a charcoal stub on the back of a scrap ledger. "And the porch, west. We'll want the light in the evenings." They didn't talk about how the house would be theirs, not hers, not his. That understanding sat between them like a third hand in the work, steady, unshakable. Through the weeks that followed, the walls rose slowly. Leif worked at the forge by dawn and returned with his sleeves rolled and his back damp, hammering through dusk. Petra brought supper in a lidded basket, and they ate sitting cross-legged on the floor beams while the wind moved through the grasses around them. One evening, she brought a tin of old letters and a bundle of folded fabric. "Polly stitched these herself," she said, smoothing the cloth. "I saved them because I didn't know what else to do. Thought maybe they could hang in the bedroom." Leif touched the edge of a piece of scrap of muslin embroidered with uneven daisies. "She had a good hand, better than mine anyway." "She was quick with a needle," Petra said, "but wild with her thread. I used to pretend to scold her for the knots." She looked down at her lap. "I don't want to leave her behind." "You're not," he said. "She'll be with us." They nailed the cloth to a crossbeam with care. Petra didn't speak for a while after that, but when she looked up, her eyes were dry. She reached for his hand and held it without speaking. When the house was near finished, the townsfolk began to notice. The pastor's wife brought a crock of rhubarb preserves, and the cooper offered a set of chairs he no longer used. Petra accepted them all without apology. No one asked for details. Folks had begun to understand that the two of them didn't need explaining. On a warm Sunday, Petra stood in the doorway of the new house, her apron tied clean, her hair braided and pinned. Leif approached from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. "The stove's in," he said. "Draw's good." "I saw," she said, "and the fence is mended." He nodded, then leaned against the post, eyes catching hers. "There's not a church in town I want to say vows in, but I'd like to stand with you here if you'd let me." She stepped forward and took his hand. "You already have." Still, that evening, with the sun low behind them and the chokecherries in bloom, they stood beneath the porch beam and spoke the words plain. No audience but the wind and the birds settling down. They promised each other what they already lived a life of shared work, quiet peace and room enough for memory, but more for hope. That night she lay beside him for the first time in the new house, her head tucked beneath his chin, his hand resting at the curve of her waist. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she whispered. He pressed his lips to her temple. "You make it easy to stay." Later, when the dark had deepened and the crickets sang, Petra whispered, "We should plant corn next year and onions. Maybe even grapes along the fence." He answered without opening his eyes. "Whatever you want. We've got time." They slept with the windows open to the warm air and the scent of cedar. Years passed, and the house settled into the earth like it had always been there. The garden grew broad, full of tomatoes, beans, and sunflowers that reached over the fence come August. A hive box perched near the cottonwoods, its bees slow and golden in the light. Leif's hands grew calloused in new ways, less from rains, more from shaping iron and clearing brush. Petra stitched less and canned more, her shelves lined with jars of plum jam and pickled squash. On autumn evenings, they sat on the porch in the chairs the cooper gave, his hand always resting somewhere near hers. They spoke little, not out of silence but contentment. Nothing hurt the way it once had. Nothing was missing. And all the years they thought they lost had led them here, to this quiet, steady love that asked for nothing but truth and time and gave everything in return.